I think ghosts are fascinating things, and they are so much more than they're actually given credit for. I believe that they serve as conduits for the attitudes and fears of a particular time or place, and portray the dominant mindsets in a culture, and in many cases, a gateway to the history that's been left untold. To me, they're a legacy, a tangible reminder of the people who came before us. And I think when looking at these stories, it's as important to ask why these apparitions are remembered as it is to question their validity. Often, in my experience within the Shropshire context, those who subvert society's expectations, the lost or the unloved souls, become ghosts. It's a way in which their legacy continue, even if their memory of their life fades into the ether. I believe what history forgets, folklore clings to, whispering the story through the ages. And I think this gives us even more reason to retell these tales. You see, I think our ghosts deserve compassion and respect. We must look beyond the narrative to the human being that existed behind the phenomena and understand the lives and the trauma they faced. And whilst I've been researching Shropshire's ghost lore, I am often struck by the harrowing nature of some of the stories, particularly those involving women and young girls. And if you've read some of my work before, you may know a little bit of what I'm talking about. Indeed, littered over Shropshire's blue remembered hills is a legacy of murder and profound violation, and unfortunately, the female apparitions that were left behind. Though this is difficult to read and to discuss, the content of these stories is part of the reason that I do what I do, and part of my motivation for studying Shropshire folklore. Many of our ghosts in Shropshire were real women once, and their stories serve as powerful personal histories. I think that these ghosts serve as a reminder, a collective rally against the indignation and ill treatment women have faced through history. We cannot forget these women, and we can't let them fade. So let us turn their quiet whispers into war cries. Their stories will be the focus of this evening's talk, and we'll be discussing several of Shropshire's forgotten women in detail, from the information behind their folk tales, as well as historical sources such as newspapers can provide for us. Some of them have more complete narratives, and some we are left with but fragments. However, their stories are nevertheless as important. These women, as a collective, they experience horrendous treatment, violation, and cruelty, and their ghosts remind us of the corrupting power of a patriarchal society. So I want to begin with a woman known as Mary Way, whose history has unfortunately been obscured by folklore. We know for a fact that her story takes place in the parish of Muckley Cross, which itself is almost forgotten about, but it sits on a road between Bridgnorth and Much Wenlock. It's a very small place, and it probably looks much the same as it did at the time of our actual story. There isn't much that happens here, if we're to believe the silence of the surrounding fields and the birdsong, which makes it, unfortunately, the perfect place for such a heinous crime. From what we can discern about Mary Way, she was a local girl, and in some versions of the folk tales, she was in her late teens or early 20s. She knew the area well, and she walked the roads frequently on her way to work. Unfortunately, if she ever truly existed, any facts about her personality or features are forgotten to folklore. But we know that she was simply walking home from work one evening when her life was tragically cut short. The story states that though she was comfortable walking these country lanes, she was still at risk. For two men were following her as she walked her way home, and they violently attacked her. Mary was unfortunately beaten and abused by these men before they murdered her. It's said that they cut off Mary's head before throwing it into a hedge and absconding from the scene of the crime. When Mary didn't return home, her parents grew worried. Her father, as well as several of the local men, they formed a search party and they went looking for her. Unfortunately, they found her body and severed head on the main road out of the village. One can't imagine how traumatic this must have been for the family and also for the local area. After she'd been found, the search widened to try and find the murderers. It didn't take long before the two men were found, apparently still covered in Mary's blood. They were arrested, and the next few days were spent trying to gain a confession. Eventually, these men did confess, and they were sent away to trial. The story says that they paid for their crimes, and they were hung at the Shrewsbury jail. And as for poor Mary Way, in death she gained no respite. Her spirit was said to wander the road between Muckley Cross and Bridgenorth in a confused and reckless state. When she is seen, her spirit often manifests without a head, which I think to me is incredibly sad. It's sad that even in death she's been denied her personhood. She was once described as a very active spirit, but since there have been new roads that have diverted traffic from the area, sightings have dwindled and she's faded out of popular memory. At first, you can't help but be shocked by the brutality of such a story and how a crime like this would have profoundly affected an area like Muckley Cross. To witness such a young woman snatched from life would have been a collectively traumatic experience and would have left a lasting impression on the community. Perhaps then that's why her ghost endured. Any strange noises became her whispers, or events became a sign that she hadn't truly gone. Hers isn't a story of anger or revenge like other famous Salopian spirits. Rather, I feel her spirit wants to understand why. Is this not representative of the community that lost her? As I have previously mentioned, at the time of writing, I can't find much historical verification of the crime. There's some evidence that dates it from around the 1600s, but this doesn't mean that we cannot learn from the folklore. To me, though I cannot specifically prove that Mary existed, it cannot be proven she's a product of complete fiction. Perhaps there was a similar crime, a murder or an attack of a young woman that later, as years passed, became the retelling we know now. As I have said, there are a multitude of examples of murdered women littering Shropshire's folklore. Perhaps hers is a story far older than we realise. If we move away from the conversations regarding historical basis, we can turn to discussions as to why her story has endured. I believe this is because she's a symbol of the collective fear of a community. She represents the reason why women quicken their pace and stay vigilant whenever walking home at night. She became the woman that didn't get away, all of our fears personified. Mary Way's story has endured because although she has been lost to time, crimes on such a scale have and continue to happen to women. As generations passed, those who told a story would have done so to remember, but also to warn young women of the dangers the world posed to them. A similar example is with the Bloody Jack serial killer narrative in Shrewsbury Castle, a character too is lost to history. His story continued to warn women not to trust strange men, the soldiers that came and went through the town throughout the Middle Ages. But to me, her story goes further than this. Her story is so relevant to our lives today. So when I was first researching Mary Way, Sarah Everard's murder littered the news. And it wasn't long before it hit me that both of these stories mirrored each other, and they represent the collective experience of womanhood stretching back through the centuries, a story of ill treatment, brutality, and murder. Mary Way's ghost is as relevant today as she was all those years ago. So now I want to turn to another story of a remarkable woman. When I first heard of Nanny Morgan, she was cast as the Wicked Witch of Much Wenlock, bestowing curses as a menace to society, and her ghost is still said to haunt the area, seducing young men who, if they fall for her, are doomed to love no other but her spirit for eternity. Now, this is a great story, but the reality is far more powerful than we're led to believe. Now, she isn't just a witch, and she isn't the only witch in Shropshire, far from it. But through analysing the sources of death, she can be known the most about. In Shropshire, there was a powerful belief in witches well into the 19th century, and as we'll soon see with Nanny Morgan, such women lived and navigated communities which were very distrustful of their power. These women are usually stereotyped as older, isolated from society, and often divulged from expectations. I believe that much of the negative association with witchcraft stems from the attitudes of the patriarchy and a society that limited and even harmed women. Thus, women who were powerful or diverged from expectations put on them were usually lambasted as witches. And in Shropshire, there is no clearer example than that of Nanny Morgan. So we don't know for sure when Nanny Morgan was exactly born, though the 1851 census lists her as living at Westwood Common and being 55, which would have seen her born around 1796 if it's accurate. She was the daughter of Richard Williams of Westwood Common, but little is known about her actual early life or her family. We do have a description of her from girlhood, however, and she's depicted as being tall, dark-haired, with steely grey eyes and a stern countenance. For me, her story really begins in 1809, when she was implicated in a robbery whilst working as a servant girl at the house of Mrs. Powell, which is in Boughton, which is another little village near Much Wenlock, alongside a girl called Mary Beamond. It's unsure who the instigator of that theft was, though the stolen goods, including the clothes, were found in Anne's possession. However, both girls were tried for the offences in Shrewsbury and found guilty. Beamond was actually transported, so Anne Morgan got away quite lightly and she was sentenced to imprisonment. Our Anne was in prison for some time, and upon leaving jail, she was in a bit of a predicament. Now, her actions had gained her quite a level of notoriety within her local community, and because of this, her family ostracised her and completely cut her off. And this provided her with no means of supporting herself and ultimately left Anne without a home. It's important to remember that she was still a young girl at this point, and options for her would be very limited, especially being unmarried and deemed a criminal. Now, this would have been a very scary situation for a woman in Anne's position, especially with the ever-present threat of things like workhouses. However, life was to present Anne with an opportunity. After searching for a place to live and a means to support herself to no avail, Anne was introduced to the local travelling community, who often came to the area to work as farm labourers before moving on to the next job. And strangely, they embraced Anne with open arms and allowed her into their community. And in that community, she found acceptance and a way of life that really suited her. She was said to have taken up unchristian ways, which you can only imagine what they were. And among her new community, Anne was taught things like reading fortunes and cards, and also how to make potions and other occult practices. And it seemed that she was actually a natural for this folk medicine and folk healing and things like fortune telling. So she was able to leave the confines of the countryside in her upbringing and travel around the country with her new community. And through reading fortunes, she was actually able to sustain herself and found a place among these transient peoples. Anne had ultimately found acceptance. She left Much Wenlock for quite some time, and the trail actually becomes cold for her until one Monday she unexpectedly returns to Much Wenlock Market. She informed the absolutely shocked locals that she'd inherited her father's house and she planned to settle there. So Anne moved home, and very quickly she used the house as a base for her business. So it was there she sold fortunes, charms, curses, and gained a reputation across the countryside for the truth in her foresight. Her skills were said to make Anne a very wealthy woman. Indeed, she was very in demand and was consulted by women of all standing, from servants to wealthy ladies. After her death, a great quantity of jewellery was actually found in her house, alongside a number of letters which were reported to have contained the signatures of women of great education. And here we see the contradiction that would mark Anne's life. Her foresight and her skills as a fortune teller were seen as a commodity to many in her community, who would seek her out for fortune telling, palm reading, and love potions, as well as hiring her as a curser. However, she was ostracised from her community and met with indignation and even fear. Anne had a real talent for cursing, it said, and she was said to have been the best in the area, delivering her curses with a terrible blow. She was so in demand for this, as well as her other practice, which I think demonstrates the widespread superstition and belief that was taking place well into the 19th century. She gained such a reputation for herself that rumours started to develop in Much Wenlock that Nanny Morgan was a witch. She's described in this time as kind of like a stock character or a cheap Halloween costume. But My question is, if they were so frightened of her, why did they seek her out for fortunes, the settlement of petty disputes, enacting vengeance, and the seduction of potential suitors? Now,